Welcome back to Lessons from the Fall. Now, I read a number this week that stopped me in my tracks. 777 South Australian businesses have gone into insolvency in the last 18 months. Hospitality's hardest hit, construction close behind. And when I sat with that number, I didn't experience it the way most people probably did. Scrolling past the headline, I experienced it the way I experience every loan file that crosses my desk. As a story I've heard before many times in slightly different clothing. I want to talk about this today because it sits right at the intersection of everything this podcast is supposed to be about: business, risk, the economy. And underneath all of it, people, real people, who built something, believe in it, and watched it come apart. Let me start with the number itself, because I think that's worth sitting with properly before we get into what's behind it. 777 businesses. Hospitality, that includes pubs, cafes, restaurants, takeaway food, is the single hardest hit category. 184 of those failures in the last 18 months alone, up from 148 the year before. Construction services close behind at 85, with building constructions adding another 26 on top of that. So between hospitality and construction, you're looking at close to 40% of every single failure in this state. I want to be honest about something. I finance construction, bridging finance, construction lending, asset-backed lending against property and development. This is the core to what Renown does. So when I read that the construction failures are running at this level, this isn't an abstract economic data point for me. This is my own risk environment. These are the conditions I'm underwriting into right now, this week. So let me tell you what I actually see when I read a number like this, because different to what the headline writers see. The first thing I noticed is the language one of the liquidators used in the article. He talked about volatility, tightening credit, increased ATO enforcements, global conflict, creating trickling down economic stress. And he said something that I think is the most singularly the most important sentence in the whole piece. And most people will scroll straight past it. He said that lead times of financial, let me rephrase that. He said the lead times people will have on financial pressures are often months, sometimes longer, between the initial stress and the breaking point, that we might not see the full impact of world events for another 12 to 24 months. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it tells you something critical about how business failure actually works. It is almost never sudden. The collapse is sudden. The cause is not. By the time a business enters liquidation, the stress has usually been building quietly for a long time before anyone outside the business noticed. And this is exactly what I see in lending. When a borrower comes to us in genuine distress, it is rare that the distress arrived overnight. What arrived overnight was usually the final event: a supplier who stopped extending terms, a tax debt that crossed a threshold, a contract that fell through at the wrong moment. But the underlying fragility was there for months, sometimes years. Thin margins, no buffer, growth that outpaced the system supporting it. A business model that worked in one set of conditions and was never stress tested against a different one. Hospitality is the clearest example of this, and it's worth understanding why it keeps showing up at the top of these lists year after year. Hospitality businesses tend to run on extremely thin margins to begin with. A good cafe might be operating on margins in the single digits. That means there is almost no room for absorption when costs move against you. And in the last few years, almost every cost a hospitality business depends on has moved against them simultaneously. Rent has risen, wages have risen appropriately, but it is still a cost that's grown faster than revenue for many operators. The cost of goods, particularly anything imported or affected by global supply chains, have been unstable. And on top of all of that, the customers themselves are under cost of living pressure, which means the discretionary spending that keeps a cafe or restaurant alive is the first thing households cut when they're tightening their own belts. Now, that's not one problem, that's 4 or 5 problems compounding. At the same time, on a business model that didn't have much margin for error, even before any of them arrived. When I see a hospitality business in trouble, in almost every case, the issue isn't bad coffee or bad food or bad service. It's that the entire cost structure of the industry shifted under businesses that were built for a different economic environment. And for most operators, they didn't understand that they needed that capital buffer to survive the transition. But construction's different. Construction is a completely different story, but it rhymes. Construction businesses are exposed to a particular kind of risk that I underwrite against constantly, which is a timing risk. A construction project is priced at the start, often months or years before it's completed. In between pricing and completion, costs can move significantly. Materials, labor, finance costs. If the project is debt funded, if a builder has a fixed price contract signed before a wave of cost inflations and that inflation arrives mid project, the builder absorbs the difference. There is no mechanism to pass it on. They've already signed. I've seen this play out directly in deals with finance. A construction loan that looked pretty serviceable at the time of approval against a project budget that was made sense at the time can become generally stressed 18 months later if input costs have moved 30% and the contract price hasn't moved at all. This is precisely why in our underwriting, we don't just look at the budget as it stands on day one. We stress test it. We ask what happens if the material costs rise by a meaningful margin. We ask what happens if the building takes longer than scheduled because because almost every cost takes longer than scheduled. We ask what the contingency actually is, not what if the label on the spreadsheet. This connects to something I talked about back in episode 40 when I went through South Australia's budget numbers and the fact that 27 out of 28 government departments had blown their allocation. I made the point then that the bad financial culture shows up in the details before it shows up in the headline. The same principle applies here at the level of individual businesses. The businesses that survive this kind of volatility are not the ones with the best year. They're the ones with the most honest relationship with their own numbers. Month to month. Who sees the stress building early and acts on it instead of hoping it resolves itself? And this is where I want to say something that might be uncomfortable, but I think it needs to be said because it's the single biggest factor I see separating the businesses that survive a downturn from the ones that don't. Most business owners know they're in trouble long before they act on it. I don't say this with judgment. I say it because I understand the psychology completely, and I've felt versions of it myself in my own journey. When your business is under stress, the instinct is almost always to keep going, to believe the next quarter will turn it around, to avoid the conversation with your accountant or your lender or your landlord, because having that conversation makes the problem real. in a way that not having it allows you to keep deferring. I understand that instinct intimately, but it is almost without exception the decision that turns a recoverable situation into an unrecoverable one. The businesses I've seen come through genuine financial stresses and survive, and there are plenty of them. This isn't a story where everyone's under pressure goes under. The common thread is always the same. They acted early. They had the uncomfortable conversations before it was forced on them. They restructured, they renegotiated, they cut costs, they sought advice, or in some cases sought finance, well before the position became terminal. The article mentions restructuring as one of the outcomes alongside liquidation, and I think the distinction matters more than people realise. Restructuring early from a position of some remaining strength gives you a genuine options. Waiting until the ATO enforcement action arrives or the receiver is appointed removes almost all of that. So, if you're a business owner listening to this, in hospitality, in construction, in any industry, feeling this kind of pressure right now, here's what I have to say to you directly. Don't wait for the breaking point to have the hard conversations. If your numbers are telling you something uncomfortable, listen to them while you still have options. Talk to your accountant, talk to your lenders, talk to the people who have been through this and survived it. The businesses going into the businesses going into the 777 on the list are not necessarily the worst businesses, that the ones that have survived. In many cases, these simply are the ones that didn't have that hard conversations. Guys, this is Lessons from the Fall. Thank you for listening.